You're listening to Let's Talk Creation, the science podcast that's just for you, with Paul Gardner and Todd Wood.
Well, welcome back to another episode of Let's Talk Creation with Paul and Todd. I am Todd Wood.
And I am Paul Garner.
And we are here to have a discussion about creation, about science, evolution, origins, the Bible, Genesis, you name it. That's our subject. Paul, this is the first time we've gotten back together to record since we've debuted our episodes. So we can talk a little bit about feedback now. And it's been reasonably good.
Yes. We're delighted. I mean, thank you to everybody who has given us a review or written to us or, written on social media. And that's fantastic. Keep your comments and feedback coming in, please.
Yes. But yeah, we've gotten, so for our YouTube, the version of the video, first episode is now approaching about 700 views, which is really one of the most popular things that we've done. We've seen, we've gotten about 150, I guess, that are listening on other podcast platforms. So we're trying to get on every podcast platform you can imagine. So if you're interested in that, some favorite platform and we don't have it, let us know and we'll try to get it on there. And yeah, we've also got a global audience. I was particularly impressed to see that we have at least one listener in Luxembourg, of all places.
Wow.
And because Luxembourg is very small, that automatically makes us big in Luxembourg. So I'm pretty excited that we're big in Luxembourg. Anyway, so Paul, you and I are really interested in creation research and creation scholarship. We also go around and do lectures and seminars, but the bread and butter of what you and I are sort of interested in and interested in, training the next generation to do is the kinds of hard work that scholars do to study questions and problems and sort of come up with reasonable answers, or at least help us to understand how the question might be framed in order to set up the next scholar coming along. And I thought, if we're going to talk about creation scholarship, I know a guy who made a movie called Is Genesis History, where he got together a bunch of scholars. I remember the day he called me, and I talked to him and he told me, I'm going to make a movie with all these creation scholars and researchers. And I said, yeah, sure you are. I had heard this story before.
We've all had the experience, I think, of somebody saying, I'm going to make a movie about creationism.
Yeah.
And then nothing ever happens. So.
Right. But, he went through with it and it actually happened. The film is Genesis History. You can stream it on many different platforms, and his name is Thomas Purifoy. And I thought it would be good to talk to Thomas about creation scholars, because he's talked to a lot of different creation scholars and he has a real heart for the work that they do. So let's bring him on the show. And here he is.
Wow. Welcome, Thomas.
It is good to be here and to see you guys again. This has been so long.
Yeah,
it has been,
it's great to have you. You're our very first guest, so this is great. We're very excited. It is for us.
It is for us.
Pleased to have
let's
you
put
here.
it that way.
Yeah.
Y'all are most kind to say so. I'm not sure anyone wants me on their podcast. I'm generally usually persona non grata in a lot of circles. So.
Oh, we are too, but in our circle we can be, persona grata. Whatever.
Persona grata, right?
So Thomas, you called me years ago, and with this idea for the film, and I told you, it's never going to happen. You're never going to get all these guys together, and I was skeptical, and my reasoning was I need to give this guy a dose of reality so he can sort of, if he's really serious about this, he'll appreciate that dose of reality so that he can be prepared for what he's about to do. He went through with it, right? He made the movie. So Thomas, what in the world, what drove you to do this? Why did, even when you're calling up these people and they're telling you, oh, it's never going to happen, oh, it's not going to happen, you kept at it and you did it. So what was driving you? Why did you feel like this was such an important thing?
I guess I think that we all are driven by different things, and probably my biggest driving force was the knowledge that there are a lot of young people out there that are, and one of them was my daughter, who, a lot of them were the kids in my Sunday school, and I realized, there's a lot of young people out there that have the same questions I always had when I was their age, and so it's really important to, answer questions for young folks. So in a weird way, this film ultimately was driven by wanting to address questions that young people have. So that's probably the long and the short of it. There's a lot of other things behind it that you and I have talked to, issues of, this push that biologos and theistic evolution is having right now in our seminaries, and in our pastors. The issue that young earth creation is sort of sometimes an anti-evolution thing, and it's not really addressing the positive answer. They're actually, as I like to say, if you can't beat something with nothing. And so the idea of just criticizing isn't going to always do you any good. You got to show that, actually is a good reason. Those are all there, but I think that the need to address the questions of our young folks who are really legitimate is probably the driving factor.
One of the things, Thomas, that I was very impressed by, in a sense, you kind of came into this as kind of an outsider. You from outside of the creationist sort of research community, but you did a prodigious amount of reading. I saw a list that you put on your website about the books that you'd read, not only across a range of scientific disciplines, but in the history of science and the philosophy of science. Tell us about some of the things that you read, some of the research that you did to prepare for making this movie.
Well, I mean, honestly, I've always liked science. I've always liked all sorts of areas of knowledge. I mean, my actually background was English and writing, but what I found is that, the world that God has, whether it's history, whether it's literature, whether it's science, are all intimately interesting. And so I can get myself lost in any of these areas. What I realized in this one was that this was an example of an area that there were lots and lots of subject matter experts. And so unless you knew at least, and I be honest, I feel like it was a rabbit holes I fell into. And so you can only go so far, and then you got to jump to the next hole, and then you got to jump to the next hole. But that they were all interesting. And even when you begin to realize that many of these areas are interrelated. And so that's what I've often found is I early on in my studies realized that it's the interrelationship of ideas that's more important. And that when you can step back and see how things work together, that's when you begin to start to realize, this is actually makes more sense in that. So when you reduce the details, you can lose sight of the big picture. But when you can pull back and see the currents of philosophy and history and, quite honest, personalities that drive things, you begin to step back and realize, actually, this makes more sense. It's not just about an empirical, this is right, this is wrong. It's like, okay, what are the currents of thinking that have gotten us here? So I had to go back and research all the areas of geology and paleontology. And then you began to see the patterns of, as what I realized early on is that the power of evolutionary thinking is in the story. It's not in the science. And when you go back and see what a guy like, who's been forgotten, a guy like Chambers, who wrote the book, back in 1844, published the best-selling book in the entire 19th century. It was not Origin of the Species, but it was what's it called? I think it's the Vestiges. Vestige of the Natural History of Creation by Chambers in 1844, which, if you've read the book Victorian Sensation, a really worthwhile reading book, which basically it's the history of Chambers' book, which was still selling more copies than Darwin in 1890. And so when you realize that Queen Victoria read it, Abraham Lincoln read it, that provided the story structure, which really, I think he was a fan of Sir Walter Scott. He was a Scot. So he understood the idea of this historical narrative So he puts in the nebula, stardust all the way to man, and he puts it into a book. And then Darwin's work, in a sense, was done by him. And all Darwin was doing was stepping in to try to give some, scientific credibility to it. But again, you go read a book and realize that, well, Darwin's views were generally rejected by the late 1890s and 1910 and so forth. I think it's a good history of biology does, or history of evolution does that. And he more picked up to the neo-Darwinian synthesis. So when you start seeing these big pictures of the story of the history, you begin to realize that a lot of the scientific, proofs were taken in and out and moved around, but it was the story that held it together. And so in that sense, to me, what was most important for creation is I felt that our story, our history actually made more sense. And it was just a matter of time of all these young researchers, guys like you, Todd, guys like you, Paul, who are really saying, wait, this empirical data fits this story well and actually makes more sense. But the hard early work's been done, and now that's kind of where the current research is. And so that's a long story to say why I was interested in doing this was like, can I make a contribution to fighting in the hedgerows? And that's all I did, a small contribution.
Small contribution. Yeah, I'll ditto what Paul said. You are a voracious reader, asking me, have I read this book? Have I read that book? And most of the time, I've never even heard of the books you're reading. and I'm supposed to be an expert in this field, but I got this focus on certain sorts of questions that sort of dictate what I read. But
well, you're a technician. I mean, that's the thing is you have to have all of it together to drive the pieces forward. It's a part and pieceful, but my area is to step back and look at the big picture. I dive and then I pull back. And so to me, it's the patterns that then drive how the thinking goes. And so early on, the history of intellectual thought made me realize that once you understand that, you begin to see how individuals play into that. And so I just think it's important to be able to dive down and then pull up. It's like swimming and then getting up and looking at the picture and then you gotta go back down. So to me, I think you're an amazing scuba diver that's got to be down in the weeds, pulling all this up to mix two metaphors. So
sure. That's fine.
So going back to making the movie, then you, how many scholars did you end up contacting and filming? I know there were some that didn't even make it into the final cut of the film.
So I probably contacted a good 20 to 30, probably more like 30 or so. We ended up interviewing, and I had to kind of cast it. So there were some great folks that I think had done great work, but didn't really have a place. John Baumgartner, I told it John Baumgartner, but it wasn't really a place for what we were doing in this film. Obviously, Paul, we talked, and I used some folks, Leonard Brand, who I actually interviewed, but they didn't really have a good place in the film, but they were important in helping my thinking through this. Then there were folks in casting, and I began to ask, this was a self-cast film where the scientists would recommend others, and the ones where everybody said, yeah, he's probably the expert in this. And I needed an expert in this. And so it was like, take you, Todd. Everyone was like, well, you're going to talk about diversification. You're going to talk about, questions about evolution. Well, really, that's Todd. And everyone agreed. Well, Todd's really the guy who's done the most work in this. You had to be a PhD. You had to have written a book or multiple papers. You had done both. You had to be respected by your peers as being kind of the subject matter expert. And hence, your area was dealing with evolution and dealing with diversification. And you did a great job at it. Oh, and human origins. So you were considered the subject matter expert. So all that work you had done. And so hence, that's just kind of how I moved through it. Kurt Wise, he's a history of life guy. He's done a lot of great stuff. But anybody that's going to study under Steve Gould, well, it was appropriate for him to do history of life and history of, that was. So that's kind of how I came to this. Is I figured out the big picture, figured out the individuals, and then let you guys were the ones that you all promoted, and said, you helped me steer through it. So I did very little, I feel like. Y'all had already done the heavy lifting.
Now, a lot of our listeners will obviously have watched the movie, but some perhaps haven't done so. And if they haven't, I highly recommend that they do go and watch the movie, because for what it's worth, I mean, in my opinion, this is the best creationist documentary that's ever been made. But for those who perhaps haven't seen it yet, give us a kind of overview. What's the structure of the movie? How does it play out? And how did you choose on those key disciplines that you wanted to kind of cover in the movie?
So the movie can be watched right now free on YouTube. It's available on Amazon, but we ended up earlier on this year putting it on YouTube with all of our, what I would call the behind the scenes footage, or our Beyond Genesis History. So that's just go to our YouTube channel, YouTube Genesis History, and there it is. The structure of the film was interesting because I had a couple options of taking it chronologically, and you kind of put the chronological order together, or topically. And so I chose the topical one and realized that I needed to start off with having people realize their own presuppositions about an old earth. And it's an interesting thing, is I think that we're all taught from a very early age that if you look at something, a rock, it's got to be old. And the question often became is, well, how do you know it's old? How do you know it's really what it is? And so questioning assumptions, I felt I had to, in a sense, disconnect people from their assumptions early on. And so the idea was, that's where I came up with Mount St. Helens. It was like, okay, is this really old? I actually had discovered Surtsey Island too. That was where we were going to end the film, was, this new island that had been created in the 60s. And that now is quite, it looks quite old, but millions of years of geology happening in front. So we found an idea of a place, and that's where it kind of, shall we say, unhinged people's view. And then the rest of the film was saying, okay, if this can be unhinged, how then do we build the positive case? And I knew that everybody would agree with me, or at least be familiar with the idea of the flood. So we then had to address issues of establishing Genesis, and then again, unhinging questions of time. So we had to deal with that. And throughout that, I put in things like, how do you then establish paradigmatic thinking? Okay, well, this is a higher level point. I wanted that section to be 15 minutes. Most people couldn't take that much, philosophy. So it got pared down to 5. Once you begin to do this and establish the text, well, then it runs kind of a simple line is running, where through you basically are reestablishing that the world maybe isn't that old. And once you put up all the ideas together, kind of the coup de grace was looking at soft tissue and dinosaur bones. And by that point, if I could get to that point, that was then the aha moment where folks were like, well, dadgum, I can believe that. So you've developed all of this evidence. Then you kind of come up with this, I see it to believe it. And then that's the point, if you notice, we move and go to Todd. And that's when we start dealing with all the evolutionary thinking. And basically, it's not about saying evolution's wrong. It's like saying, well, yeah, I could see how you kind of damn it with faint praise. Well, yeah, they could see that, but really it's not the best explanation. You can see how they could make a mistake and get here. Okay, let's reinterpret the data. So then, but is this not a better explanation? And so then it's building through life, which I think is very interesting. And so Todd presents the idea of, diversification of creatures, or blueprints, genetic blueprints, and it makes more sense. You dig into the genetics with Rob Carter, and folks are always kind of astounded at how complex the genetics are. And then from that point forward, it's really a cleanup job dealing with a few major issues, old light, what is the idea of the stars and where does that come from? And then dealing with the human archaeological record, which by that point, you're getting into areas that are back into the Bible. And then I wanted to end talking about culture and Adam and Eve, which I think is where we really are, dealing with what is the implications of these ideas for theology and for the way it works out today in our lives. Gender theory, all that stuff goes back to Adam and Eve and so forth, which we're dealing with. And then the film's over. So that's kind of an overview, was how do I lay it out to deal with problems that I know are there while I'm creating a structure that people can begin to hang their hats on. And by the time you're over, the problem is that it was drinking from a fire hose for basically 110 minutes. So what we found is people would binge the film. It got released on Netflix, and we got all these comments, people saying, yeah, I watched the film 8 times to understand it, or I watched it 10 times. And what it was so much information so fast, which you're totally not supposed to do. It began to make people realize they had to ride the merry-go-round literally over and over, and they began to re-look at stuff. And then it began to put a structure in their head that was, oh, I think I understand this.
Yeah, and I want to follow up with that, because when we filmed, we went to the Memphis Zoo. So I became known as the Zookeeper for some reason. And so people say, oh, I like the Zookeeper. Okay. And we filmed all day, and you kept banging on me and harassing me and saying, you gotta make it, you gotta say it simpler. You gotta say it simpler. And I kept going, man, if I make this any simpler, I'm going to be lying because it's too simple. Because it's not simple. It's complex. You know, that's what all of us scholars want to talk about. All the nuance and the complexity and stuff. And so you show me the working print. And I think, oh, I mean, I love it. But man, I'm really uncomfortable with some of the things because it's oversimplified, right? It's too simple. And I remember vividly the first couple of times I went to a premiere. I basically every time it showed, I went to a showing, got recognized a couple of times, and I remember walking out of it and people telling me, "Wow, that was so complicated," and I thought, "You can't be serious! It was too simple." So you were absolutely 100% right about that. Yeah, I think that's part of being a scholar is that you're in so deep, right? And you totally forget that there are still folks out there who are scratching their heads about the very basic assumptions that we use to sort of frame and begin our research. And so thank you for making us appear more human.
I think that was the big deal. And two things about that. It wasn't just being more human. It was that one of the things that totally drove me nuts. And so I don't like people that are bullies, and I don't like people that say things about other people that are absolutely not true. And so the idea of talking about the scientists not only being human, but about being loons, fools, not scientists, that chapped my hide about as much as anything else. And I basically wanted to take it and stuff it down someone's throat. And so at the end of and I know that sounds kind of aggressive, but it's true. And I wanted at the end of the film to say, well, you may not agree with these guys, but you can't at all say they're not good scientists and they haven't done research and aren't super smart. And so that was what I was really pleased by the end. Everyone would say, excuse my French, but I won't say it because y'all are online, but dang, these guys are really smart. And so that was a huge deal. So it wasn't just human, but like being smart humans.
Yeah. You're right. I get the same sort of thing. The just assumption that we're mentally delusional or something like that, and
or complete idiots, and we don't know anything about the science.
Exactly. Yeah. I debated in college, and it's called an AdHominem Argument, and it's a way of dismissing things that you don't want to really argue about. And I've seen this regularly. It's like, I just don't want to deal with the data, because the problem is the data really is saying this, and your structure and interpretation of the data is actually better than my interpretation of it. Well, I mean, this is $1 trillion problem, because if this really isn't true, then what you're doing is you're basically saying, we're on the Titanic and we're headed for an iceberg. And folks are like, oh, no, we're not. You guys are crazy. And so, because the Titanic can't be sunk and it's worth a lot of money and it's going to kill a lot of people. And that's how people look at it. It's the jobs of people, the millions of people whose jobs rely on evolution being true. It's the hundreds of billions and trillions of dollars of textbooks and material and movies and all this stuff that supports it. And then more importantly, it's the moral structure. I mean, going back to Aldous Huxley, it says, hey, the reason we want to believe that Genesis isn't true is because we want to have sex with whoever we want to have it with. There's a whole lot of implications, is that if we're really just animals, well, then we can do whatever we want morally. But if we're not, to quote, was it Steve Gould that says, yeah, I can't go there because if I did, then that would mean that God was there and he's going to judge me at some point.
Right.
So those are all pieces into this, but that's why I think that what y'all do is so important, is you're pushing on an issue that is the issue. Like, if all of intellectual thought kind of comes down to one really strong steel column. And I would say this, I think evolutionary thought is a really strong steel column. It's not, to point you out, you said this before, Todd, it's not a theory in crisis. It's got major problems internally, but there's so much structure around it. We're kind of hitting at this, knowing that if it ever comes down, the whole thing comes down. And so that's why this has to be protected absolutely by everybody, even going, ad hominem, saying whatever. You're getting at the root that's at the base philosophical point of our entire modern, postmodern, intellectual, atheistic edifice. If it goes, the whole thing goes. and everyone knows it.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, definitely. Well, let's break for a second here. We have a little word from our sponsor, and then we'll get right back into it. You've been listening to Todd and Paul Talk Creation. If you'd like more information about any of the subjects discussed in the show, please visit us at coresci.org/podcast. That's coresci.org/podcast. If you'd like more information on sponsorship opportunities, or maybe you'd like to have a product or book reviewed or discussed on our podcast, please contact us at podcast@coresci.org. That's podcast@coresci.org.
Is Genesis History is the film that is a first step on a journey toward understanding the history of the earth according to Genesis. Follow along with narrator Del Tackett as he travels across the continent with over a dozen scientists and scholars to see fascinating new evidence of creation and a global flood. This film is free to watch on the Is Genesis History YouTube page, along with all the Beyond features which dig deeper into young earth creationism. Be sure to check out the New Creation blog as well, which is sponsored by the film, at newcreation.blog. That's newcreation.blog. Now, let's get back to the podcast.
All right, welcome back. We are still here with Thomas Purifoy. We are talking about Is Genesis History and Creation Scholarship and how he made the film, why it's important. And Thomas, let's talk a little bit here about what was the reception? How did you get it out there in the first place? And again, this was another astonishing thing to me when you told me, we're going to put it in theaters. And I thought...
I mean, I will say, so part of this is one of my, a good friend here, he had, I mean, the reason we did this is it wasn't just me. There's always, every film has one side, the guy that creates it, another side, the guy that funds and markets it. So I did one side, but I had a good friend of mine here, Bill Reeves, who basically was the reason this thing happened. Bill's a young earth creationist and an incredible producer, an incredible marketer, an incredible funder. And so he said, hey, I want to fund this. And then his company marketed it. And so they're the ones who put it in theaters and really got behind it, figuring out partnerships, figuring out, pulling different groups together to promote it. And so that's really the reason it went to theaters, is because of Bill. Who is just really amazing what he can do and has done in the Christian movie industry. Most people don't know the people behind the scenes that make all this stuff happen. But I do think that there was a lot of latent interest of waiting for something like this. And there was a need for it. And so in that case, the market was ready. And the market kind of continues. So the fact that evolution is so strong, this evolutionary old earth, man from monkey's view that it's been around for some time, it is always anyone that picks up their Bible and starts reading Genesis 1 and then knows what they've been taught in school feels the cognitive dissonance of what's going on. And so they're saying, if this view that I've been hearing in schools is true, it really is a problem for what I've also been reading in the Bible, and vice versa, whichever one you read first. I think the film begins to address right at the center of that, trying to resolve that tension. So hence, there's always going to be a need for folks wanting to hear more about this. And I think that what's incumbent on us is how do we make it simpler and simpler? And that's not simplicity, but making it clear, because if simplicity is true, then it's going to lead them to go get more and more complex. And so that was the case. The film in that way is really it's a door, even though it's complex, to what we realized, the film is in 110 minutes, but we filmed 20 to 30 hours with these scientists. And so that was, for me, my interest was always to let them hear more of the scientists. And that's kind of what I see us being, as a bridge or a gateway to really getting more complex. So in a funny way, Todd, you said, we had to start simple, but then I gave them the unadulterated Todd Wood, the unadulterated Kurt Wise, the unadulterated Rob Carter. And what this is listening to them. And that was our Beyond is Genesis History series, which is 48 videos, about 15, 16 hours of material. And that's kind of the next step down, where, I heard Todd talk about diversification. But what does he really mean by this? Oh, I'm going to go listen to him talk for 15 minutes about it. And then another 15 minutes on this, which in some cases also abbreviated. So that was why we then said, I want a conference. And so we created a conference of 70 hours of material where, oh, I'm going to hear him talk much more. And that's really, I mean, that's all online for free on our YouTube page, or you can get all the conference for like $5 on our website. And I think that people don't realize how much depth of work these scientists have done. And in a sense, that's still the top of the iceberg. You guys start looking at all the ICC, you know, the International Conference on Creation papers, Answers Research Journal, you know, all the different stuff that's getting published out there. There's a lot of great material you guys have been doing for years that I think the public needs to know about.
Yeah. And I'll echo that. The reception, the need that you tapped into really was genuinely amazing to me. I saw the film in theaters 4 or 5 times. I know I saw it multiple times. I saw it in California. I saw it in Tennessee. I went down to Georgia to see it one night. Every showing that I went to was full of people. And it was amazing to me. When I first went in, I thought, it's a documentary. How crowded is it going to be? It was crowded. It was good that I got there early to get a seat because it was packed. And you're absolutely right. There's a world out there that doesn't have a clue what creation scholarship really looks like and what it's doing. And even though there are all these ministries out there doing the work to promote it, there's still avenues that could be explored that would reach other people that are just not being reached. So yeah, the movie was a really
and you had to run some encore showings, is that right?
Because there were. That's how they do it. I mean, Fathom, which is the company that does it, they'll usually, this is called a short run. So you've got in theaters, the theatrical world, and not to get into all that, but it's very risky. And you're trying to market and put things in theaters. And the normal run theaters, it costs X amount of dollars to market to get in. So they've introduced these short runs, and that's what this is. They'll usually run them Monday through Thursday when there's usually less theatrical interest. So they usually have an encore to get set up because they know that it's only for one night. So they're going to have a few others. What we'll find though, is that what was interesting to really get the word out is, the theatrical is in a sense a marketing push because people are going to watch it and see it. It's then the film hit Netflix very early in June. And because that's immediately going to 50 million homes in the US, it immediately people began to get it on their feed. And so what was interesting, and we saw this with the film on YouTube, many of these, to take it from a shrewd manager parable perspective, there's many things that the secular world wants to do that if they can make money with it, they're going to promote what you're doing. And so much of this promotion happened because there was some interest. Well, people are clicking on it. Well, the algorithms are going to take it and push it to more people. So in many cases, what we realize is that there's plenty of marketing tools that then just keep it moving. And so the film has actually, and this is very curious, this is the Lord's grace, it has continued to sell and done in some cases better year after year than it did prior years. So my hope is that what I feel very remiss about is not having put more stuff out, just because it takes time and energy, and I'm intellectually lazy, I think, to get more things out and going. There's so many more research things. We're working on a new documentary right now with Andrew Snelling and looking at some of his research, because that's what I think is important. I want to be looking at what is creation science and how do creation scientists do their work. And I think that's a vital thing, is that what you said, they don't even know they don't know it's been done. They don't even know how it's done.
Right.
So we had this unique opportunity, and we're given footage of Andrew doing some research down in the bottom of the Grand Canyon, taking some samples in some bent folds that are, hundreds of feet high and wide, and just crazy looking stuff. Those people don't even exist. We actually were able to capture this, or we had someone, Alliance Defending Freedom captures, gave us the footage. And then we've kind of slowly walked forward. We're about to head up to Cedarville in a month and film John Whitmore breaking sandstone, trying to bend sandstone in some, big, engineering, civil engineering and mechanical engineering labs, which I think is what you guys do. Is you're actually dealing with the real world. You're not armchair guys sitting back and saying, well, maybe this works. You actually are doing experiments. And that's what I think I appreciate about you, Todd and Paul, is that y'all are actually doing work that is the really kind of in the weeds, hard, roll up your sleeves, dusty, this is hard thinking, that I think that's what creation science really is. And I think it's the whole young generation that needs to know this, because we find there's tons of young folks who are like, how do I get into this? How do I do this? And that to me is what, back to my original point, why did I make the film? It was for answer young people's questions, but it was to encourage young people to get into creation science. Because let's be honest, I mean, we're all losing our hair at some point. I mean, Todd, you're the youngest, I guess, because you have the most hair, right?
That must be it, yeah.
But we need younger guys and girls coming into this to step up and do the work.
Mm-hmm. I think for most people, if they know creationism at all, they know it as a popular movement, right? So they're familiar with, conference and seminar speakers like Ken Ham, or they're familiar with the output of big creation organizations like AIG or CMI or ICR. But you're right. I mean, underpinning that popular movement is this whole world of creationist scholarship that most people know nothing about. Even people who are familiar with the popular creation science stuff. There's this whole community of biologists and geologists and people in other disciplines who are getting their hands dirty and doing the kind of basic science and contributing to developing that creation model. And they're probably not so well known, but those are the people at the coalface. And
Absolutely.
One of the great things about your movie is that it highlights, it showcases the work of these kinds of people without whom we don't have a movement, right?
Oh, no, I think that's what's most important, is that sometimes they can be forgotten. And I actually think that people find it very refreshing when they don't understand everything. And so for all my comments about simplicity, getting them in, I think it's important to realize that God's world is way more complex than anything we can understand. And that what drives science, for what drives these creation scientists, and it's interesting, I got into a debate recently, an ongoing friendly debate with a professor of geology at Columbia University, so Ivy League college. We spent hours on the phone debating this. I mean, again, this is, I think, the power of young Earth creation. He was not convinced, but I certainly wasn't convinced by, an evolutionary geologist, atheist, who I think understood things really well. He was like, oh yeah, the reason I know the Bible's not true in the Word of God is because I know that this history is, of the evolutionary history. And I was like, exactly. The reason I know, you're getting that if this is true, you're right, this Word of God's not true. But if I'm right, then your whole history of the world also is wrong and your view is wrong. And so the stakes were high, but in talking to him, his big deal was the reason he does what he does is science education for the next generation. And he's very concerned that these people need to know what the real scientists are doing. He being a real scientist, and he is one. But I feel like that the more people realize how complex God's creation is, the more they realize that there's a certain awe and wonder of worship, to quote our good friend Kurt Wise, that you get into. But it's also just the excitement of seeing that this is a world that is so complex. And that to me is refreshing. Reading Todd's papers, reading your papers, Paul, and not being able to understand half of it in a good way makes me realize that, oh yes, it's a humbling experience. And at the same time, making you realize an exciting one, that there's so much more to know, and that God's put us here. The work you're doing, I think, is kind of tip of the spear for understanding what I was talking to this guy about. All the great scientists of the past are they agree with me. So all these guys that you like to quote, they're the ones, and he makes some comment, I think it was kind of bizarre. I kind of called him on it. And that's the importance. People have to know the history about how all these scientists, agree with him. I say, no, they didn't. Maxwell, and I started quoting all these guys, and he said, oh, they go back hundreds of years. And I said, no, they don't. I said, look it back. And I started quoting guys in the more recent present. And he kind of had to, I said, so Newton's on my side, Maxwell's on my side. I started listing all these Galileo's on my side, all these guys, Kepler, all these guys were on my side. They didn't agree with you. They would have thought you're crazy. And that kind of gives people a pause when they realize that all these great scientific heroes, Isaac Newton was a creationist and a young Earth creationist. He wasn't, and he's the greatest scientist ever. Let's put it that way. And so I think we need to be able to encourage folks like, well, just because they're old, we still use all Newton stuff. As more of Newton is taught in school than anything that Darwin is taught when you think about mechanics and classical mechanics. So I feel like it's important that emphasize the scientist and that we have a long history.
One thing I'm really interested in, Thomas, is as an outsider, you're looking in at this creationist research community, and you're absolutely right. I mean, we don't have the resources of secular scientists in secular academic departments with access to, the grants that these scientists have. So what are the challenges that you see that are unique to the creationist research community, and what are the needs that the scientists have, and perhaps how can ordinary Christians out there who kind of want to see this work happen, how can they help? How can they support what the scientists are doing?
I think that honestly, prayer is the number one first thing. Is they ought to be praying for you guys and saying, hey, the Lord is the one who blesses stuff. The Lord is the one who opens up doors. So that's probably the first thing we all need to be thinking about. So I always need to remind myself, yes, I don't need to be doing more work. I need to be doing more prayer. Secondarily, they can do it through funds. And I think what Core Academy, Biblical Creation Trust, each of you have nonprofits. We've even started a little something called the Genesis Fund to try to encourage this. And I think that there's an idea of funding, even if it's up $25 a month, is a big deal to encouraging young people to do this work, and putting money where their mouth is, because the implications of this are so huge. Putting a little investment in it is, instead of going out to dinner, okay, I'm going to go actually support this creation group this month, is a big deal. And so each of us all are involved in stuff. And so pooling funds in a way to help the young folks and you guys do your work is vital.
So Thomas, what else you got going on? So you mentioned you're working on a new documentary. You have a company, right? Compass Classroom?
Yes, well, so that's my real world. So yes, exactly. This is my hobby. Yes, so to actually pay the bills. Although Genesis has been, we actually, although we kind of just circle money in to support itself in a way to keep it moving. Our main company is a homeschool curriculum company called Compass Classroom. But one of the things we have been interested in doing is creating more science curriculum. So I'm actually working right now with guys like Marcus Ross, Jeremy Blaschke, and others to create a new video science curriculum, and then we want to put some books out. Eventually creating a whole middle school and upper school science curriculum with books and videos that will do something that has not been done before. And I think that's what I'm always interested in, is how can you approach education outside the box in an exciting way? And so I can't do that in a few weeks. That's a multi-year project, but we're actually starting on it, and we're trying to link up. We just literally talked about it this week. How do you equip the next generation of young creationists to really understand what science is and what creation science is from a biblical perspective? I mean, the specter of scientism is one that both secular philosophers and Christians are recognized as very, very dangerous. And I think the power of scientism, that somehow the priests of science can tell us what they do, and because they know more than the average person, many, many non-Christian atheistic philosophers are like, this gives me a lot of concern. So I think that even teaching young Christians to be wary of what really is science and what is really the limitations of it. I was chatting with Oz Guinness at one point, and Oz at one point said, it's kind of funny how science, in the world of science, can't even speak to some of the basic questions that we all have, which is, does my mother really love me? How do I know, what I really like and what I'm supposed to do with my life? You can't go do a scientific experiment to tell you that one way or another, but we assume that science is all powerful and can tell us everything. And so I think it's important that we realize the limitations of science, and that hence, that's what I'm interested in doing, is putting science, as Paul Nelson once said, science is the handmaiden of theology, and that how does it fit in terms of the whole spectrum of things God has given us? Very important, but let's put it in its right sphere.
And you've been helping me with a book project, Thomas, as well. Because,
yes, well, that's talk about an honor. I mean, so Paul, your book, The New Creation, was actually recommended by Todd and I think was probably one of the more important books that I read. And we've been selling it for years. So Todd said, you must read these books. And he told me, and I followed him, like a student to a teacher. He said, I can still remember it. Read New Creationism. I've got it on my bookshelf. Look at this, the original one I wrote. I read. And he said, read, this is not the original version, Faith, Reason, and Earth History.
Yeah.
And I can pull them up. They're right there. Excellent books. And so your new book is looking at Earth history kind of basically from a younger perspective, I think, with some amazing watercolor illustrations. And we kind of had the privilege of helping get that published. So it's really been an exciting thing to watch.
Yeah.
It's a full story. I mean, you tell me, you can describe it better than me.
Well, one of the things when I was a boy that inspired me to get interested in geology was reading these fantastic coffee table books with these lovely dioramas of, reconstructing past environments with extinct animals and plants in them. And even before I was old enough to really understand the text, it was the illustrations that captured my imagination. And I've long thought that we really need a book like that will capture the imagination of the next generation, but written from a creationist perspective. So, I started to work on this manuscript, looking at the fossil record from a creationist perspective. And I worked with a fantastic, very talented artist, a lady called Jean Elizabeth, who produced over 200 fantastic watercolors to accompany this book, including some wonderful double-page dioramas. And we've got a fantastic designer working on the book who's produced some fantastic spreads, page layouts. And I'm really excited about this book. We don't have a publication date just yet, but hopefully it's not going to be too far into
soon. Yeah, I mean, you're just dusting up the last minute stuff. I mean, I've been looking at the spreads. They look great.
Yeah, and I'm really excited about it. And I think it's going to be a book that works at different levels. I think younger children are going to just love the artwork. And then I think teenagers up are going to, appreciate being able to read the text alongside all of the illustrations. So I'm really excited. I'm so pleased that we've been able to partner with you to get this book done.
Well, it's a privilege. And that's what I think. I mean, Todd's had a book, The Quest, that he wrote and is unwell. And I think there needs to be more of this. I think the ability to take what you do, which is more complex, let's be honest, and move it down to what I would not say is overly simple, but a semi-technical level to get people up. And then you ask, what do I think needs to happen? And sometimes with the creationists, what do they need? I also think they need time together and the ability to say, okay, here's what we think we know. Here are areas that we have to bend on. And I think the collaboration is super important. Collaborative projects. You can think about what RATE did years ago. Catastrophic plate tectonics. So RATE was radioisotopes on the age of the Earth, and Andrew Snelling, Steve Austin, guys, I think John Baumgartner worked on that, I think. Same with catastrophic plate tectonics, with Kurt Wise was in the mix. All of these guys worked together for years and that was early ICR stuff, and original Henry Morris, made sure that happened. So I think we need more of those projects that are going to grapple with, the Cenozoic. What near and dear to my heart is post-flood stuff, primarily because we didn't really address it. And there were so many things I look back on our film and realize, I did not do a good enough job putting this in context, because it's that linear structure of time that I think that's what evolutionary thought has built on since 1844 very smartly. And I think creationists need to focus on that more. How do we put the pieces we know or don't know into some view of time? And I think it's owning the real time is what matters. And in a sense, it displaces other views of chronology and time. And so I think we have to go back to the history. And I think that those are still very much wanting. Your book, I think, is a good example of this, where you're trying to put these pieces in a chronology. And that's one of the things I really like about it. You're doing it. But it's got drawings. I would love for us to go, that I would think is a lower level book. I would love to see a follow-on that is done by a group of scientists saying, okay, here's what we're gonna try to put this into timeline. Yes, we don't know what maybe Are we Septuagint? Are we Masoretic? Are we neither? But we're at least going to say, yeah, we're going to make a stab and say, here's where we are.
Right. I think you're bringing up kind of full circle back to where you started, right? The compelling nature of the story.
That's right.
That having a story to tell and capturing people's imagination with that is maybe even more powerful than I hate to say it, but more powerful than the research we do, right? The research that we do to sort of contribute to these stories, but the story itself is the thing that captures people's imaginations and that they need to see.
And a story that's real. I mean, it's the idea of saying, as C.S. Lewis would say, myth become fact, but it's this idea of the story of basically a God that would speak the world and everything into existence actually has an incredibly compelling logic to it. As I remember going back to Paul Nelson, we got into this, is that so much of the world is so complex, it actually makes much more sense for it to be happening simultaneously than over a long progressive period. And almost everything we do engineering-wise happens simultaneously. All the parts are brought together and work. I think that there is an essential logic to creation that then becomes very relieving in a sense to know that, the reason that I am the way I am and that I struggle in my life is because there was a perfect man who was created and then he fell. And that helps me understand my psychological and sin issues. And to know that, that actually explains why the world works well, but doesn't work perfectly. That there are, it's amazing designs that you talk about, Todd, with animals. And yet there's imperfections in them. They're viruses, biological evil, things that I know you love to talk about. Well, what are the reasons for this? We just passed a dead deer on the side of the road. And my daughter looked over at it the other day, and we were driving down, it looked like it had been hit by a car. And every time you see a dead animal, it's a reminder, well, was there millions and billions of years of this before, man? Did God create it like this? And everything shouts and says, not the God I know. He would never create a world that would have dead animals in it everywhere. And I think that's a real quick reminder that our view of the world, that I think is the true view, does not impute that to God, because that's not in his character. And so I feel like these are what you're getting at, are the character of God issues. That you're in a sense defending God from saying, well, he used, billions of years of death to get to where we are, which is what a theistic evolutionist has to hold, or even an old earth progressive creationist. You must have hundreds of millions of years of death, bloody, terrible death and pain. And that's just not the God we worship. It's not the God of the Bible. It's not the God that created the world like that.
All right. Well, on that note, can you tell us where to find you online? Are you on social media and websites and so forth?
So I do not have any online existence. I'm not even sure anyone I have any friends in terms of Facebook and all. Is Genesis History, however, we have a very sharp young geology student that manages our social media pages. So you usually can find us there. That things will worm our way back to me if someone needs to get in touch with me through our isgenesishistory.com website, which is have a contact us. And we have that, and we have our Facebook. I think we have Instagram. I don't know what all we have. YouTube, I think, too. So I have other people better than me that run a lot of that stuff. But I do think that, at the end of the day, I mean, we're all in this together. We're a small little community, so a small band of brothers, so to speak.
Is there a place we can find out more information on upcoming publications from maybe Compass Classroom?
Oh, there should be. Well, it reminds me, I need to probably put all this all together. So a lot of this stuff, the Nehemiah, all of stuff like that, actually, that'll probably eventually start making its way to the Genesis. I think it's, we've got a Nehemiah Foundation site, but the Genesis Fund actually will working itself through that, and the New Creation blog. So we got to mention that. So New Creation blog is where lots of these students are taking ICC papers and translating them into semi-technical works. So that's likely where we'll be putting a lot of our publication of Paul's book, and his upcoming stuff will be promoted through that.
All right. And we'll have all those links for you in the show notes. Anything you want to add, Paul?
No, I think that's great. I was going to mention the New Creation blog, but Thomas beat me to it.
Yeah, New Creation blog, something very exciting, being run by creationist students. So these are science grad students, science undergrads that are sharp, excellent writers, basically taking what you all have done and making it a little more understandable to the public and then giving access to it. So that's been a real privilege to kind of see more and more of these folks get involved. And that's my hope, is we have a whole team of these students writing and studying, and we hope to publish more research with that and use it as a way really for creation scientists to have a voice and a place where they're putting stuff out, and kind of a central place they can discuss stuff and publicize things.
That's fantastic. All right. Well, thanks for watching, everyone. Thanks for listening. Those of you who are just listening, be sure to check us out on our social media accounts. We're on Facebook and Instagram. You will find us on YouTube. We really appreciate all the great feedback. Leave us a comment. Leave us a like or a dislike, whatever you like. We'd like, whatever you want to do. We'd like to hear from you.
And given what we were talking about earlier, Todd, we should also mention that there are ways for people to give to our respective ministries if they want to do that, if they feel that's something they'd like to do.
Yes, indeed. So, Paul, where would I go if I wanted to donate to Biblical Creation Trust?
You would go to our website, biblicalcreationtrust.org, and there is a donate button on the homepage that will take you to our giving page with all of the various options. And there are even options for people who are outside the UK.
Can I set up a monthly donation then?
You can do that, yes.
Fantastic.
Yes.
You can do that at coresci.org/donate as well if you'd like to support the work of Core Academy. That's our organization here in the United States. We are busy with many different projects right now. Looking forward to hopefully COVID restrictions easing up a little bit in the summer and the fall so we can get back to our normal routine, but we would very much appreciate your support. You can also find out more about our podcast at coresci.org/podcast. Or you can email us your comments or questions, podcast@coresci.org. That's CORESCI.org. I think that's everything. Are we good? So our next episode, back here in a fortnight, and we're gonna talk about common questions. Is that right, Paul? Common questions.
That's right. Where did Cain get his wife?
Oh no, not that one again.
How did the animals fit on the ark, and all of those kinds of common questions that people have. So we're going to
answer everyone's questions. So be sure to come back. There will be no more questions after this episode, so everyone will know everything. So, well, thanks for watching, everybody, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of Let's Talk Creation. If you have questions, send them to podcast@coresci.org. That's podcast@coresci.org. And be sure to let your friends know about Let's Talk Creation. And check us out on social media. Thank you.